All right. So, I think this is something that we can probably all relate to, overthinking. You know that feeling that your brain just turns into like a hamster wheel, especially when you're trying to, relax or whatever.
Yeah.
And we've got some really interesting stuff to dive into today. We've got like a practical guide from Healthline, and then just a deep dive into like the psychology of overthinking from another source.
Yeah, that sounds like a great pairing. I think we can bridge the gap between, practical tips and the science of kind of why they work.
Yeah, exactly. So before we get into like solutions, I'm kind of curious about the why. Like, is overthinking really more than just like an annoyance? Does it actually have consequences?
It absolutely can. So overthinking, it's not just about feeling like mentally cluttered. It can be linked to like higher levels of anxiety and even depression.
Hmm.
And think about it. When your mind is like constantly churning, it's kind of like your brain is running a marathon in the background,
Yeah.
right? So it's draining your energy and it makes it harder to focus on what matters.
That makes sense. It's kind of like trying to work with like a million tabs open on your computer.
Yes.
Everything just like slows
A perfect
down.
analogy. And there's actually research to back this up. So studies in journals like Clinical Psychology Review and Behavior Research and Therapy have found that chronic overthinking depletes what they call like cognitive resources. So it's kind of like having less mental bandwidth for everything else.
Oh, okay. So it's definitely something worth addressing. But before we jump into solutions, I'm kind of curious about like the root of the issue. Why are we wired to overthink in the first place?
Well, it is multifaceted, but one of the most fascinating theories is that overthinking is a sort of evolutionary hangover, right? So back in the day, constantly scanning for threats, that was essential for survival.
Mm.
Now, our brains haven't quite caught up with modern life.
Hmm.
So instead of saber-toothed tigers, we're stressing about deadlines or what someone said in a meeting.
So our brains are kind of like stuck in overdrive, even though, the threats are different.
Exactly. That fight or flight response is triggered by, everyday stressors, leading to that mental loop of worry.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really good way to put it. So knowing that, overthinking is more than just like a nuisance and that it's rooted in how our brains have evolved, let's talk about what we can do about it. The Healthline article mentioned mindfulness, which seems to be like everywhere these days.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people, myself included, kind of hear the word, but, we're not exactly sure what it entails.
Yeah. Mindfulness is often, uh, I think, oversimplified,
Mm-hmm.
but at its core, it's really just about bringing your attention to the present moment without judgment. So it's like hitting the mental pause button on that constant stream of thoughts.
Okay. That sounds like great in theory, but how do you actually like pause your thoughts, especially like when they feel like they're running a mile a minute?
Yeah. There are a lot of techniques, and some are surprisingly simple. You don't need to, like, sit in a lotus position on a mountaintop or anything
Yeah.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
A study in the Mindfulness Journal actually highlighted the effectiveness of something called the four-count breathing method. It's as simple as it sounds. So you inhale for 4 counts, you hold for 4, and you exhale for 4. And repeating this really simple pattern can actually help shift your focus from your worries to your breath.
So you're basically giving your mind like a physical anchor to like pull it out of that mental whirlwind.
Precisely. And this study found that this kind of practice can actually reduce what's called rumination. That's like the clinical term for overthinking, and even improve your ability to regulate your emotions. They found that people who practice this regularly were less likely to get swept away by negative emotions.
That's really interesting. It sounds like a really accessible tool that, people can use in any situation. Aside from mindfulness, what are some other kind of methods for like rewiring our overthinking brains?
Another technique that has a lot of scientific backing is something called cognitive reframing. It's
Yeah.
based on the idea that our thoughts, they're not always an accurate reflection of reality.
So it's about kind of like challenging those negative thought patterns that tend to like fuel overthinking.
Exactly. It's about stepping back and questioning those automatic thoughts, especially the ones that make you feel anxious or stressed. Think of it like this. Research from cognitive therapy and research found that reframing negative thoughts can actually help you see problems as opportunities for growth.
Hmm.
So instead of saying, like, I always mess things up, you might reframe it as, I'm learning from my experiences,
Yeah.
right? It's about actively shifting your perspective from a negative to a more balanced and constructive one. And what's fascinating is that studies have shown this isn't just positive thinking. It can actually change the way your brain reacts to stress over time.
Wow, that's amazing. So we've got mindfulness to ground us in kind of the present moment and cognitive reframing to challenge those negative thought patterns. Are there any other tools we can add to our, overthinking toolkit?
Absolutely. Another surprisingly effective method is journaling.
I have to admit, like when I hear journaling, I think of like teenage diaries filled with angst. But I'm open to hearing how this can, help with overthinking.
Yeah. It's not about keeping like a detailed account of your day. Yeah. Think of it more as a way to like declutter your mind, right? So it's like taking all that mental noise and putting it somewhere else
Yeah.
where it can't keep swirling around in your head.
Okay, I can see how that would be helpful. It's like giving those thoughts like a physical outlet.
Exactly. And there's a fascinating study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology that actually delves into this, right?
Hmm.
And they found that writing about your thoughts and feelings, they call it, like expressive writing, it can significantly reduce stress, it can improve mental clarity, and it can even help you like organize your emotions.
So you're not just like venting, you're actually processing those thoughts and feelings in a way that helps you kind of like make sense of them. Yeah.
That's right. And there are different ways to approach journaling. So one is called brain dumping, where you just write down everything that comes to mind. No censoring, no editing.
I like
It's
that.
just like a mental purge.
I love that idea, just getting it all out on paper. What are some other like journaling methods?
Another popular one is gratitude journaling. So this is where you focus on, things you're thankful for, and this can help shift your perspective from negativity to positivity, which can be incredibly helpful when you're stuck in that cycle of overthinking. And then there's problem-solving journaling, where you actually focus on a specific problem and you brainstorm potential solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a more structured approach that can help you, break down a complex issue into smaller, more manageable steps.
So it's kind of like using your journal as like a thinking partner.
Exactly. It's a safe space to like explore your thoughts and feelings without judgment.
Okay, so we've got mindfulness, cognitive reframing, and journaling. Are there any other strategies we should consider?
Sometimes the best way to overcome overthinking is to take action. So it's easy to get stuck in what's called analysis paralysis, right? Overanalyzing every detail, but not actually making any progress.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. So how do you shift from that overthinking mode to like taking action?
It starts with creating a plan. So
Mhm.
break down your goal into smaller, more manageable steps. This makes it feel, less overwhelming and gives you a clear path forward. And remember, focus on what you can control
Yeah.
rather than getting bogged down by, things you can't.
Yeah. That's great advice. So action is like the antidote to overthinking.
In many cases, yes. It's about shifting from a passive state of worry to an active state of problem solving.
Hmm. I love that. But what about when we're overthinking about like the past, like dwelling on mistakes and regrets and things like that? How do we deal with that kind of like mental replay?
Yeah. That's where self-compassion comes in.
Hmm.
And it's about treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer a friend. So instead of, beating yourself up for past mistakes, you offer yourself grace.
Exactly. It's about like acknowledging those difficult emotions without judgment and reminding yourself that everyone makes mistakes. It's part of being human.
Right.
I think that's like a message we all need to hear sometimes. So, how do we actually like practice self-compassion?
One simple technique is using affirming phrases. So, for example, when you catch yourself dwelling on a past mistake, try saying to yourself, may I accept myself as I am, or I'm learning and growing from this experience.
Mm-hmm. Those are like great examples, like giving yourself like words of comfort and encouragement.
That's the idea. It's about like being on your own side, even when you mess up.
Mhm.
And research has shown that self-compassion can actually help break those cycles of self-criticism and regret that often fuel overthinking.
This is all like incredibly helpful. So we've talked about mindfulness, reframing, journaling, action, and self-compassion. Is there anything else we need to know about tackling overthinking?
One final point I want to emphasize is the importance of embracing uncertainty.
Okay. Isn't uncertainty often like what triggers overthinking in the first place? How can we embrace it?
It might seem counterintuitive, but trying to control everything or predict the future, that's like a recipe for anxiety, right?
Yeah.
Learning to accept that some things are simply beyond our control can be incredibly liberating.
So it's about like letting go of that need for certainty.
Exactly. And a 2018 study actually found that accepting negative emotions, including those related to uncertainty, can actually improve psychological well-being.
That's really fascinating. So instead of like resisting uncertainty, we're learning to kind of make peace with it.
Precisely. It's a mindset shift that can make a world of difference.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces kind of fit together. So we've got like a whole arsenal of tools to tackle overthinking, from like calming the mind to changing our perspective to taking action and embracing uncertainty.
Yeah, it's a holistic approach that recognizes that, overthinking is a complex issue with like multiple layers.
And I want to remind our listeners that they don't have to face this alone. If you're feeling overwhelmed by overthinking, reaching out to a trusted friend, a family member, or even, a therapist can be incredibly helpful.
Absolutely. Seeking support is a sign of strength, not weakness.
So true. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into overthinking.
It's been a really insightful exploration. We've, delved into the why, the what, and the how of kind of taming those racing thoughts.
And we've learned that, it's not about like eliminating overthinking altogether. It's about learning to manage it and even like use it to our advantage.
Exactly. Finding that balance.
Well said.
Right.
Now let's take a moment to kind of like process all this great information. And when we come back, we'll dive into even more practical tips and techniques for breaking free from that mental loop.
Welcome back to our deep dive into overthinking.
I'm ready for more practical techniques to quiet that mental chatter.
Okay, well, I think you'll find this next strategy especially intriguing. It's called thought stopping.
Thought stopping. That sounds almost like something out of like a sci-fi movie or something.
Yeah, it's simpler than it sounds,
Mhm.
but it's rooted in a really powerful idea, interrupting those automatic negative thought patterns. So when you catch yourself spiraling, you quite literally tell yourself to stop.
So you're basically like putting on the mental brakes.
Exactly. And you can say it out loud or silently to yourself, whichever works best in the moment. The key is to kind of disrupt that negative thought loop before it, gains momentum.
Okay, I can see how that would be helpful, but what happens after you've like stopped the thought? Do you just leave a blank space?
That's where the second part comes in, replacing the negative thought with something more constructive. So instead of, I'm going to fail this presentation, you might replace it with, I've prepared well, and I'm going to do my best.
So it's like a two-step process. Stop the negative thought, then replace it with like something more positive or realistic.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is that the more you practice this, the more you'll start to kind of notice those negative thoughts before they even take hold. So you're essentially training your brain to catch them early on and redirect your thinking.
Yeah, it's like learning to like rewire those automatic responses.
Exactly. Over time, those positive thoughts will become more and more natural. It's like creating a new mental pathway.
Thought stopping is definitely going on my list of things to try. What else can we do to kind of manage those worry spirals?
Here's one that might sound counterintuitive at first. Schedule worry time.
Wait, you're suggesting that we actually like set aside time to worry?
I know it sounds a bit strange, but hear me out. The idea is that instead of letting worries, pop up randomly throughout the day, you contain them to a specific time slot. So, for example, you might decide to worry for like 15 minutes each evening.
Okay, so instead of trying to like suppress those worries altogether, you're kind of giving them a designated outlet.
Exactly. And when worries come up outside of that scheduled time, you simply acknowledge them and gently remind yourself, I'll address this during my worry time.
I see. It's like creating a mental container for those thoughts rather than letting them like spill out everywhere.
That's a great way to put it. And what's interesting is that people who use this technique, they often find that by the time their worry time arrives, those worries don't seem as pressing or important anymore.
That makes sense. It's almost like taking the power away from those kind of intrusive thoughts by giving them like a designated space and time.
Exactly. It's about regaining a sense of control over your worry rather than, letting it control you.
Okay, I'm going to give worry time a try. It definitely goes against like the usual advice of, just don't worry about it, but I can see the logic behind it. What else can we do to like challenge those pesky overthinking patterns?
Another powerful strategy is to challenge your assumptions. And this involves, really examining those negative thoughts that are kind of fueling your overthinking and questioning their validity.
So instead of just accepting those thoughts as like truth, we're putting them on trial, so to speak.
Exactly. Ask yourself, what evidence do I have to support this thought?
Hmm.
Is there another way to interpret this situation? Am I catastrophizing or assuming the worst.
It's like becoming your own thought detective.
I love that analogy. And
Yeah.
often when you really dig into those negative thoughts, you'll find that they're based on assumptions or fears rather than facts.
This reminds me a bit of the cognitive reframing technique that we talked about earlier. Are they kind of related?
You're right. They share a common thread. Both involve, actively questioning and challenging those automatic negative thought patterns. So it's about becoming more aware of your thinking habits and consciously choosing more balanced and realistic thoughts.
Okay, so we've got thought stopping, worry time, and challenging assumptions. What other strategies should we explore?
Sometimes the best way to break free from overthinking is to shift from analysis to action. And this involves, taking a proactive approach to kind of addressing the issues that are causing you to worry.
So instead of getting stuck in that mental loop of like what ifs, we're taking concrete steps towards like finding solutions.
Exactly. Start by clearly defining the problem that you're overthinking about. What specific aspect is causing you the most anxiety? Then brainstorm potential solutions. What are some different ways you could approach this problem? What are the pros and cons of each option?
Yeah, it sounds like a structured problem-solving process.
It is. And by taking action, you're not only, addressing the problem itself, but you're also regaining a sense of control and reducing those feelings of helplessness that often fuel overthinking.
This reminds me of what we talked about earlier, action being like the antidote to analysis paralysis. Sometimes the best way to quiet the mind is to, get moving.
Absolutely. It's about shifting from passive worry to active problem solving.
These are all like incredibly helpful strategies, but what about those times when we're feeling completely overwhelmed by our thoughts, like we're like drowning in worry? What do you suggest for like those moments?
Yeah, in those situations, it's essential to prioritize self-care. Remember, overthinking often stems from, stress and anxiety.
Hmm.
So taking steps to kind of soothe your mind and body can make a world of difference.
Self-care is so important, but it's often like the first thing to go when we're feeling, stressed and overwhelmed. What are some specific self-care practices that you like recommend for overthinkers?
Well, anything that helps you, relax and de-stress can be beneficial. It's really about finding what works for you. So some people find relief in, physical activity, things like yoga or walking or dancing. Others prefer quieter activities like reading, listening to music, or spending time in nature.
So it's about like tuning into what your mind and body need in those moments and giving yourself permission to like prioritize those needs.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of, simple things like getting enough sleep, eating nourishing foods, and staying hydrated. These are the foundations of, good health, both physical and mental.
Yeah, it's so true. We often like neglect those basic needs when we're caught up in our thoughts.
And when you're taking care of yourself, you're better equipped to, handle those challenging thoughts and emotions. You're building resilience from the inside out.
I love that perspective. Self-care isn't selfish. It's like an essential part of, managing our mental well-being. So to recap, we've covered a wide range of techniques in this part of our deep dive, from thought stopping and worry time to challenging assumptions, problem solving, and prioritizing self-care.
Yeah, it's a diverse toolkit, and I think it highlights the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to, overthinking. It's about finding what works for you and building a personalized approach.
Exactly. And the key takeaway here is that we have options. We don't have to be prisoners to our thoughts. We can learn to manage those overthinking tendencies and create a calmer, more peaceful mind.
That's a powerful message of empowerment. We can choose to engage with our thoughts in a more constructive way.
I'm already feeling more like hopeful and equipped to tackle this. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one more question I'd love to like get your insights on. How do we know when overthinking has crossed the line and become something like more serious, that might require professional help?
That's an important question. It's crucial to recognize that overthinking exists on a spectrum, right? So for some people, it's an occasional annoyance, but for others, it can be like a debilitating force that significantly impacts their lives. So if overthinking is consistently, interfering with your daily life, relationships, or work, that's a sign that you might benefit from professional guidance.
So if it's no longer just about like those racing thoughts, but it's actually preventing you from like living your life fully, that's like a red flag.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Other signs to watch out for include, feeling constantly anxious or worried, having trouble sleeping or concentrating, withdrawing from social activities, or experiencing physical symptoms like headaches, fatigue, or digestive issues. These could all be indicators that overthinking is kind of taking a toll on your well-being.
Yeah, those are like important things to pay attention to. And I think it's like essential to emphasize that there's no shame in seeking professional help. In fact, it's a sign of strength and self-awareness.
Absolutely. A therapist can provide support, guidance, and evidence-based strategies to help you manage those overthinking patterns and develop healthier coping mechanisms. They can help you understand the underlying causes of your overthinking and create a personalized plan to address them.
That's such an important message. Now, as we wrap up this deep dive into overthinking, I'd love to leave our listeners with like a final thought or challenge. What's one small step they can take today to start kind of breaking free from that mental loop?
Here's a simple but powerful suggestion. Pay attention to your self-talk. What are those voices in your head saying? Are they critical, judgmental, or fearful? Or are they kind, compassionate, and encouraging?
Oh, that's such a crucial point. Our inner dialogue can either fuel our overthinking or help us like tame it. It's like having like a constant companion in our minds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just like we choose our friends in real life, we can choose to cultivate a more supportive and encouraging inner voice. So
Mm,
challenge those negative thoughts, reframe them, and replace them with more positive and empowering ones.
I love that challenge. It's a reminder that we have the power to change the way we think and feel, and that realization can be like incredibly liberating.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been a truly insightful and, dare I say, mind-expanding conversation.
It's been my pleasure. I hope our listeners feel inspired and empowered to tame their overthinking and create a calmer, more peaceful mind.
And remember, you don't have to do it alone. Reach out for support, practice those strategies, and believe in your ability to change. You've got this. Welcome back to our final segment on taming overthinking. It's been a pretty incredible journey so far.
It really has. We've explored the roots of overthinking, its impact on our well-being, and a variety of practical strategies to kind of manage it more effectively. Yeah, we've covered mindfulness, cognitive reframing, thought stopping, worry time, challenging assumptions, problem solving, self-compassion, embracing uncertainty, the importance of self-care, and even, knowing when to seek professional help. It's quite a toolbox, right?
It is, and I think what's most important for our listeners to remember is that they have options. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to taming overthinking. It's about finding what works for you and creating a personalized strategy.
Exactly. And what's been really powerful for me throughout this conversation is this idea that we don't have to be like victims of our own thoughts. We can actually, learn to take control and shape those thought patterns.
Exactly. It's about shifting from feeling overwhelmed to feeling empowered, and that's a truly liberating realization.
Hmm. Now, before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your thoughts on something we haven't really touched on yet. What about like the role of habits? It seems like overthinking can kind of become like a default mode for some people.
That's a great point. Overthinking can definitely become a habit just like any other behavior. And when it comes to habits, there's this fascinating concept called habit loops. And these loops consist of a trigger, a routine, and a reward.
Hmm. So, in the context of like overthinking, what might those triggers be?
Well, triggers can be anything that sets off that overthinking cycle. So it could be like a stressful situation at work, a difficult conversation, or even just a quiet moment alone with your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And then the routine is the overthinking itself.
Exactly. It's that familiar pattern of, analyzing, worrying, and replaying scenarios in your mind.
And what about the reward? It
Yeah.
seems strange to think of like overthinking as having a reward.
Right. It might sound counterintuitive, but often there is a perceived reward, even if it's, a negative one. So for
Mhm.
some people, overthinking provides a sense of control, even if it's like an illusion of control. It can feel like you're doing something, even if it's just mentally spinning your wheels. That's fascinating. So to break the habit of overthinking, we need to like disrupt that habit loop.
Precisely. And there's several ways to do that. One strategy is to become more aware of your triggers. So once you identify those situations or thoughts that tend to set off your overthinking, you can start to develop more constructive responses.
So instead of getting like sucked into that overthinking vortex, you're creating a detour.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it might involve, using some of the techniques we discussed, like mindfulness, reframing, or thought stopping
Yeah.
to interrupt that automatic response.
Right. And I imagine the reward part of the loop is also important to address. If overthinking is providing like a sense of control, even if it's a false sense, we need to like find healthier ways to feel in control.
Absolutely. That might involve, developing a stronger sense of self-efficacy, focusing on problem solving, or practicing acceptance of, things you can't control. It's about finding more empowering ways to cope with uncertainty and challenges.
Hmm. This is all incredibly helpful. It seems like taming overthinking is like a multifaceted process. It involves, understanding the science behind it, developing practical skills, and even, addressing those underlying habits that keep us stuck in those thought patterns.
It is, and it's a journey that requires, patience, self-compassion, and a willingness to experiment with different approaches.
Hmm.
But I truly believe that with effort and the right tools, everyone can learn to manage their overthinking and create a calmer, more peaceful mind.
That's a beautiful message to end on. Thank you so much for guiding us through this deep dive into the world of overthinking. I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of like how my mind works and more importantly, how to work with it, not against it.
It's been my pleasure. I hope our listeners feel inspired and empowered to take charge of their thoughts and create a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
And remember, you're not alone on this journey. Reach out for support, keep practicing those strategies, and never underestimate the power of your own mind to change.
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.